Our story begins in the wide, open heart of North America in the 1800s, a land without fences where the horizon stretched so far it seemed to bend into the sky. This was a time when the Great Plains rolled endlessly, a sea of grass whispering in the wind, and the air was filled with the calls of birds and the heavy tread of bison herds. It was also a time when some of the most feared and respected Native American tribes moved across this vast space. Their presence felt long before they were seen. In this era, the land itself was as much a force as the people who lived upon it. There were no borders drawn on maps here, no lines to mark where one nation ended and another began. Instead, the boundaries were understood through rivers, mountain ridges and trails worn by generations of travellers. For the tribes of this land, the earth was not simply a place to live. It was an ancestor, a guide, and sometimes a shield. Among these tribes were names that would travel far beyond their own territories. The Comanche, whose mastery of the horse made them unmatched in speed and mobility. The Apache, who could vanish into deserts and mountains where few could follow. The Lakota Sioux, whose command of the northern plains was as vast as the land itself. These were people whose reputations were carried on the wind, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in fear, always in respect. The Great Plains in those days were alive with movement. Herds of bison roamed in numbers beyond counting, their migration shaping the rhythm of the seasons. Wolves shadowed them, picking off the weak and the stray. And somewhere between predator and prey moved the human hunters, lean, skilled, and always watchful. They read the land like a book, the bend of a blade of grass or the scatter of stones telling them stories invisible to most eyes. The Comanche in particular seemed almost born to the saddle. A boy might be placed on a horse before he could walk, his small hands gripping the mane as the animal moved beneath him. By the time he was grown, horse and rider were one, able to race across open ground at full speed, loose arrows with deadly accuracy, and disappear into the grasslands before their enemies knew what had happened. Entire villages could pack and move within hours, following the herds or seeking new hunting grounds. Farther south and west, the Apache moved with a different rhythm. They knew the harsh deserts and rugged mountains as intimately as others knew the prairies. Their endurance was legendary. They could travel great distances on foot with little water, slip through rocky passes without leaving a trace, and strike with precision before melting back into the landscape. To pursue them was to walk into a trap of sun, stone, and silence. The Lakota Sioux, meanwhile, commanded the northern plains with a mixture of mobility and deep tradition. Their camp circles stretched wide, tipis arranged in patterns that reflected the order of their world. They too had embraced the horse, and in battle they were swift and relentless, their riders moving as a single wave. Yet just as important as their skill in war was their connection to the spiritual world, which infused every part of their lives, from the hunt to the council fire to the moments before battle. In the 1800s, these tribes were not isolated from one another. The plains, deserts and mountains were a web of shifting alliances, rivalries and trade routes. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy was not the soldier from the fort, but another tribe seeking to expand its hunting grounds or reclaim old territory. Raids were swift and brutal, but they were also a way of life, a test of skill, courage and cunning that could bring honour to those who survived. Yet even for the most feared, survival was never guaranteed. Harsh winters could strip the land bare, forcing hard decisions about where to travel and what to hunt. Drought could drive game away, leaving villages hungry. And always the push of settlers and soldiers grew stronger, pressing in from the east, bringing with them iron rails, firearms and diseases that no warrior's skill could fend off. Still, for a time, these tribes remained powerful forces in their own worlds. Their riders appeared without warning, their warriors fought with both ferocity and strategy, and their knowledge of the land allowed them to vanish into the very earth itself, leaving behind only the faint echo of hoofbeats or the fading trace of a campfire on the wind. It is here, in this shifting and dangerous world, that our story will follow them, one by one, beginning with the Comanche, whose rise to dominance changed the face of the plains forever. From the rolling hills of the north, where their ancestors once moved on foot and hunted with patience, the Comanche journeyed southward into a world made for speed. It was not the land alone that transformed them, but the arrival of a creature unlike anything their people had ever known, the horse. They were not the first to see it, nor the first to ride it, but no other people would ever master it so completely. A Comanche and his horse moved as one, the rider shifting his weight with the animal's stride, guiding with knees and voice alone, leaving his hands free for the bow, the lance, or the short musket taken from defeated enemies. From horseback, a Comanche warrior could fire arrows in a blur, loosing them so fast the shafts seemed to form a cloud. This new power allowed the Comanche to move like the wind itself. The great open plains, endless seas of grass stretching from horizon to horizon, became their kingdom, and they named it Comancheria. Its boundaries were not drawn on any map. They shifted with the seasons, the buffalo herds, and the will of its warriors. By the mid-1700s, their influence stretched over what is now Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and deep into northern Mexico. They pushed out rival tribes, most notably the Apache, whose once dominant presence in the southern plains was steadily driven westward. Settlers, traders, and even soldiers soon learned that entering Comancheria without permission was to gamble with one's life. Wealth, to the Comanche, was measured in hooves. A large herd meant power, the ability to trade for guns, ammunition, metal tools, and cloth, to marry well, to feed one's band through hard winters. Raids were often aimed not at capturing land, but at capturing horses. From New Mexico to the heart of Mexico itself, they struck with precision, disappearing into the plains before pursuers could give chase. Hunting was no less central to their way of life. The buffalo was the Comanche's lifeblood, providing food, clothing, shelter, and tools. The hunt was swift and deadly. Warriors rode alongside the thundering animals, leaning low to strike at vital points with arrows or lances. In a single chase, a skilled hunter could bring down several buffalo, his horse weaving through the stampede as though it too understood the rhythm of the hunt. Life moved with the seasons. Camps were light and mobile, wickiups and teepees that could be packed in moments, loaded onto travois and pulled by horses. Bands travelled where the herds roamed, where water flowed, and where opportunity called. The Comanche's greatest strength lay in this mobility. No single place defined them, and no enemy could easily corner them. They were not merely warriors, but diplomats. Some bands forged temporary peace with neighbouring tribes or colonial powers, trading hides, meat, and horses for weapons, blankets, and goods from distant lands. Yet alliances were never permanent. They could dissolve as quickly as they were made. To the Comanche, survival was not about loyalty to outsiders, but loyalty to their own people. By the dawn of the 19th century, they stood at the height of their power. Even Spain, whose empire spanned oceans, negotiated with them, sending gifts in exchange for peace along the frontier. When the United States expanded westward, its settlers found themselves facing not just a tribe, but a military force that knew every river crossing, every waterhole, and every trick of the land. But no empire lasts forever. Disease brought by outsiders claimed countless lives. The destruction of the buffalo herds in the mid-19th century struck at the heart of their culture. And yet, even as their numbers fell, the Comanche resisted fiercely. Leaders like Quannaparker, a man who carried both Comanche and Anglo blood, led raids into the 1870s before making peace, and then worked to guide his people through the difficult shift to reservation life. The Comanche had ruled the plains for over a century, reshaping the very balance of power in the West. Their story is one of transformation, of a people who saw a new force in the horse and remade themselves into the swiftest, most formidable riders the world had ever known. The Comanche did not simply ride. They were born into the saddle. From the moment a child could walk, they were introduced to horses, learning to cling to a pony's mane before they could even speak in full sentences. Young boys would ride without saddles, guiding with bare legs, practicing until they could leap onto a mount from the ground in a single motion. By the age of 10, many could gallop at full speed, drop to the far side of the horse's body, and fire an arrow beneath its neck, their bodies shielded from enemy fire by the horse itself. Girls, too, learned to ride and handle weapons. In Comanche life, every member of the band needed to be capable, for the survival of the people did not rest solely on the shoulders of warriors. Women drove horses during migrations, butchered buffalo after the hunt, and defended camps when warriors were away. They were the keepers of the lodges, the masters of preparing hides into the supple leather that became clothing, shelters, and gear. Warrior training was relentless. Young men were taught not just how to fight, but how to endure hardship without complaint. They learned to ride for days with little food, to sleep on open ground through icy winds, to read the land for signs. A faint track in the grass, a broken twig, the smell of a campfire carried on the breeze. A seasoned Comanche could tell how many riders had passed, how fast they travelled, and how long ago, all from a few prints in the dust. Raiding was both an art and a necessity. Sometimes it was for revenge, to answer an insult, reclaim stolen horses, or punish an enemy tribe. Other times it was for profit, seeking the wealth that came from herds and captives. Raids were often planned with careful precision. Scouts were sent far ahead, moving silently and avoiding detection, sometimes watching a target for days before the main party struck. Under the cover of night, warriors would ride in utter silence, their horses' hooves wrapped in strips of buffalo hide to muffle the sound. At dawn, they could descend upon an unsuspecting village with terrifying speed. Horses were driven away first. Without mounts, enemies could not pursue. If the raid went well, the Comanche would be miles away before alarms were fully raised, leaving behind only dust and fear. There are stories, passed down through generations, of raids so bold they seem almost like legend. One tells of Comanche warriors riding hundreds of miles into Mexico, striking a wealthy hacienda, seizing horses by the dozens, and vanishing back across the Rio Grande before the nearest garrison could even mount a response. Another speaks of warriors appearing as if from nowhere on a vast plain surrounding a caravan in moments, then disappearing again, taking every horse, but leaving the people unharmed as if to send a message. We control this land, and we allow you to leave only because we choose to. Even in battle, the Comanche relied on movement over brute force. They avoided drawn-out fights whenever possible, preferring hit-and-run tactics. A skilled rider could fire arrows so rapidly that enemies swore they faced twice as many men. The bow remained their favoured weapon well into the era of guns, not out of tradition alone, but because it was faster, quieter, and deadlier at close range from horseback. Every warrior carried with him a piece of the spiritual world, perhaps a feather, a painted shield, or a medicine bundle blessed by a shaman. Before battle, warriors might paint their faces or bodies with designs meant to call on strength, protection, or swiftness. The act of painting was not mere decoration, it was a prayer made visible, a sign that the warrior had stepped into a sacred space where life and death met. The power of the Comanche lay not only in skill or numbers, but in the deep, almost instinctive understanding they had of the plains. They knew where rivers would run dry in summer, where herds would pass in autumn, where the safest crossings lay in flood season. This knowledge, passed down through generations, made them nearly impossible to outmaneuver. Soldiers from the east, unfamiliar with the vast emptiness of the land, often found themselves chasing shadows, or worse, being drawn into traps by an enemy they could never seem to pin down. And yet, for all their reputation as fierce warriors, the Comanche were also a people of laughter, of stories told around fires, of songs carried on the wind. A successful hunt meant feasts, dances, and the telling of old victories. A night in camp could be filled with the pounding rhythm of drums, the high cry of singers, the stamping of feet in the firelight. These moments bound the people together just as much as their skill in war. Still, the horizon always held change. The buffalo herds, once so vast that a rider could travel for days without losing sight of them, began to thin. Traders brought more guns, but also more whiskey. Soldiers began to move deeper into Comancheria, building forts and cutting trails. The storms of the coming decades could already be felt in the distance, like the rumble of thunder before a summer rain. It is just before dawn. The sky is still deep blue, but along the far horizon, there's a faint whisper of light, pale and cold. In the hush, the land feels endless, a sea of grass swaying in the breath of the plains. Somewhere in that sea, a small band of horses stands perfectly still, their ears pricked, their breaths rising like ghosts in the chill air. Crouched low beside them are the riders, Comanche warriors, their hair bound in braids, faces streaked with paint. The designs are personal, each one carrying a story, a zigzag of lightning for swiftness, a handprint for victory, a black line for the memory of a fallen brother. They have been riding all night, following the faint tracks of a herd and the whispers of scouts who returned under cover of darkness. Ahead lies a small settlement, a cluster of lodges belonging to a rival band. their horses penned close to camp for the night. The warrior's leader raises a hand, and in an instant every man is utterly still. Even the horses seem to sense the moment. A boy barely 16 grips his bow tighter. It is his first raid, but his uncle rides beside him, giving no sign of doubt. The boy remembers the lessons drilled into him since childhood. Do not let your heartbeat guide your hand. Do not be the first to strike unless the spirits give you the sign. Do not lose the horse beneath you, for it is your life. Then the signal comes. The leader lowers his hand, and the world explodes into motion. The warriors lean forward, horses surging under them. Hooves strike the ground with muffled thuds, each wrapped in buffalo hide to silence their approach, until the camp is within sight. Then, a piercing war cry tears through the morning stillness. Dogs bark, shouts ring out, and the startled enemy stumbles from their lodges. It is already too late. Comanche riders sweep in from multiple sides, moving like water around rocks. Some break toward the horse pens, slashing the ropes and driving the animals into a gallop. Others loose arrows in quick, fluid motions, not to kill all they see, but to scatter, confuse, and control the ground. A rider leans so low he disappears behind his mount's flank, loosing arrows beneath the horse's neck without slowing. Another seizes a fleeing pony's mane and swings onto its back without breaking stride. The boy sees an enemy warrior raise a musket, fumbling to fire. Before he can take aim, the boy's uncle is there, a flash of painted shield and the blur of a club striking down. The musket falls into the grass. The boy realizes his hands are steady. He draws, releases, and his arrow thuds into the ground inches before another man's feet, forcing him back. It is over in minutes. The Comanche do not linger. This is not a siege. It is a strike, swift and devastating. The newly captured horses are driven ahead at full speed, the warriors riding hard behind them. By the time the sun fully clears the horizon, the camp is only a memory on the wind. That night, miles away in the safety of their own territory, the warriors will feast. The boy will be given his first war name, one he will carry for the rest of his life. Around the fire, the raid will be retold again and again, each detail sharpened until it becomes part of the tribe's living history. This is how the Comanche held power for so long, not through sheer numbers, but through the constant reminder that they could appear anywhere, at any time, and vanish again like smoke on the plains. They were not just riders of horses, they were riders of the wind. For now, though, the Comanche still ruled, swift, untouchable, and feared across the southern plains. But to the west, in the harsh deserts and rugged mountains, lived another people whose endurance was as legendary as the Comanche's speed. A people who had become both their rivals and at times their uneasy allies, the Apache. The Apache homeland stretched across an unforgiving landscape, from the high deserts of what is now New Mexico and Arizona to the rugged Sierra Madre in northern Mexico. Here, the land itself was a test of will. Summers were blistering, with days where the heat shimmered off the rocks until the air felt heavy to breathe. Winters could bring biting winds and sudden snows in the higher elevations. Water was scarce, and food was never guaranteed. But to the Apache, this was not a wasteland. It was a living map they knew as intimately as a warrior knows his own weapons. Every hidden spring, every shaded canyon, every deer trail and cactus fruit patch was part of a mental atlas passed down through generations. Where others saw endless emptiness, the Apache saw opportunity and safety. They were not a single unified tribe, but a collection of closely related groups: Mescalero, Chiricahua, Jicarilla, Lipan, and others, each with their own leaders, their own hunting grounds, and their own rivalries. Yet they shared a way of life built on mobility, cunning, and an unshakable independence. In times of danger, they could vanish into the mountains so completely that an army could spend weeks searching and never find them. Their camps were small, often no more than a handful of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings of brush and grass, set in hidden valleys or tucked behind ridges where smoke could not be seen. At a moment's notice, they could be dismantled, packed, and carried away, leaving no trace behind. Like the Comanche, they were skilled riders, but their style of warfare was shaped as much by their environment as by their enemies. While the Comanche thundered across open plains in lightning-fast raids, the Apache fought as shadows and whispers. They struck where the enemy was weakest: an isolated supply train, a lone patrol, a ranch far from help, then melted back into the wild. Their knowledge of terrain made pursuit almost impossible. To an Apache warrior, patience was as much a weapon as a bow or a rifle. He could lie in wait for hours, unmoving, letting the desert sun bake the earth around him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their raids were not only about war, they were about survival, securing food, horses and weapons in a land that gave nothing freely. In the stillness of the desert night, an Apache scout could travel for miles without a sound, following the faint glow of a campfire far ahead, his bare feet finding their way over rock and sand by memory. The desert might seem silent, but to him it spoke in subtle languages. The sudden hush of birds, the shift of wind through mesquite, the distant crack of stone under a careless boot. They fought not just the armies of Spain, Mexico, and later the United States, but also the Comanche themselves. And yet there were moments when these two powers of the frontier found common cause. A brief alliance against a mutual threat, a trade of captives or goods, or the shared hunt of a great buffalo herd crossing the borderlands. Still, the Apache's greatest strength was not their alliances or their weapons, but their ability to endure, to outlast those who tried to conquer them. The land they called home had already done the work of shaping them into survivors. Armies could be outnumbered, forts could be burned, but the desert belonged to the Apache. The Apache did not go to war carelessly. Every raid, every battle was chosen with precision, for survival left no room for waste. Days before a strike, scouts would slip out ahead of the war party, travelling light and fast. They carried almost nothing: a bow, a few arrows, perhaps a knife, and a water skin made from animal hide. These scouts were the eyes and ears of the war party, tasked with finding not just the target, but the safest way in and the quickest way out. They watched from high ridges, blending into boulders and brush, scanning for the thin ribbon of smoke that might betray a camp, or the distant glint of sunlight on metal that marked a soldier's rifle. From these vantage points, they memorized the enemy's movements, how many men, when they ate, when they slept, which direction their horses were tethered. To the Apache, knowledge was more valuable than firepower. A single detail, a guard who stepped away from his post at the same time each night, a patch of tall grass where a man could hide without being seen, could mean the difference between a clean escape and a deadly trap. When the scouts returned, the war chief, chosen for his skill and proven bravery, would listen in silence, nodding as each detail was recounted. The Apache valued warriors who could think as well as fight. A reckless fighter could bring disaster to the entire band. A patient one could bring home victory. The night before the raid, the camp grew quiet. There were no loud boasts, no drunken songs. Apache warfare was built on discipline and focus. Warriors would prepare their weapons in near silence, checking the bowstrings, sharpening blades, counting bullets. Those who had rifles would wrap them in leather to keep the desert dust from clogging the mechanism. Some bands followed small rituals, a pinch of tobacco cast into the fire as an offering to the spirits, a whispered prayer to Usen, the life-giver, asking for swiftness and safe return. Others painted their faces with earth pigments, red for courage, black for death to their enemies, patterns passed down through their clan's warriors for generations. Before dawn they would move out, not all together, but in small, silent groups that could slip between the shadows. The desert's chill clung to them as they crossed dry washes and climbed over rocky ridges, the soles of their moccasins soft against the ground. Every step was deliberate, every movement quiet enough that even the restless desert jackrabbits remained undisturbed. If the raid was against a military post or a settler's ranch, they would strike at the hour when the human body is weakest, just before dawn, when even the most vigilant sentry could feel his eyelids grow heavy. At the signal, a hawk's cry or a low whistle that could be mistaken for wind, the warriors moved in. They came fast and sudden, but never without a plan. Some would rush the horse corral first, cutting tethers and driving the animals away. Without horses, an enemy could not give chase. Others would set fire to supplies, knowing that destroying food and ammunition could wound an enemy as deeply as any blade. And when the Apache decided it was time to vanish, they did so with almost supernatural swiftness. A pursuing army could follow them into the desert for days, but the land favoured the Apache. They knew where water lay hidden in rock hollows, where a canyon narrowed into a trap where their tracks could be lost in a dry riverbed. Pursuers would find only empty sand and the echo of their own frustration. To the Apache, war was never about glory. It was about balance, taking what was needed, defending what was theirs, and ensuring their people survived another season in a land that demanded everything and forgave nothing. For generations they remained unconquered. Soldiers wrote in frustration that fighting the Apache was like fighting ghosts. They were there one moment, gone the next, leaving only the scorch of burned supplies and the knowledge that they would return someday from some unseen path. One story, told again and again in frontier settlements and around Apache campfires, speaks of a raid so perfectly executed that it became legend. It began in late summer, when the mesquite pods had ripened and the prickly pear fruit turned red. The air shimmered with heat, and the ground cracked in the relentless sun. A small Apache band, led by a warrior named Taza, known for his calm under fire, had learned of a supply convoy bound for a military fort deep in the territory. The wagons carried rifles, ammunition, flour, sugar, coffee, and medical supplies. For the fort, it was a lifeline. For the Apache, it was an opportunity. Taza sent out his scouts. For 3 days they shadowed the convoy from the high ridges, never revealing themselves. They learned the pattern. At midday, when the sun was at its fiercest, the soldiers stopped to rest in the shade of mesquite trees by a dry creek bed. The horses were watered from barrels, the men ate and dozed, and in those hours their guard was down. The Apache planned their strike for the 4th day. Moving at night, they crept ahead of the convoy, reaching the creek bed hours before the soldiers would arrive. There they dug shallow pits in the sand, covering them with brush to create hiding places. Others concealed themselves in the thick undergrowth, their faces painted with black stripes that broke the outline of their features. When the convoy came into view, the Apache waited, silent as stone. The soldiers dismounted, tethered the horses, and sought what little shade they could find. The heat made them sluggish, their movements lazy. That was the moment Taza gave the signal, a sharp whistle like the call of a desert quail. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Warriors burst from the creek bed and the brush, arrows flying, rifles cracking. Before the soldiers could form a defense, the Apache had seized the horses, cutting them loose and driving them into the desert. Others slashed open the supply sacks and spilling flour into the sand, seizing rifles and ammunition. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The Apache melted back into the desert, disappearing into arroyos and canyons known only to them. The soldiers, stranded and on foot, could do nothing but watch the dust clouds of their departing mounts fade into the horizon. For the fort, the loss was devastating. Without supplies, they were vulnerable. For the Apache, it was survival. Those rifles and that food would keep their people safe for months. The raid was spoken of for years afterward, not just for its success, but for its precision. It showed the heart of Apache warfare, patience, planning, and a mastery of the land that turned even a small band into a force no army could easily crush. And so the Apache endured, living and fighting in a world that sought to erase them. They were not the fastest riders like the Comanche, nor the most numerous, but in the art of vanishing into the land and striking like lightning, they had no equal. But the story of the feared warriors of North America does not end in the deserts of the Southwest. Far to the north, where the prairie grass rolls like ocean waves beneath a boundless sky, lived a people whose presence commanded both respect and caution, the Lakota Sioux. If the Apache were the masters of disappearing into the desert, and the Comanche the undisputed lords of speed and pursuit, the Lakota were the kings of the open plains. They thrived in a land so vast that the horizon itself seemed to bend away from them, where the wind was constant, the winters punishing, and the summers alive with the rumble of buffalo herds. To understand the Lakota's power, you must first understand their home. The northern plains were a place of extremes. In winter, blizzards could sweep across the land without warning, smothering the world in white and bringing winds that froze flesh in minutes. In summer, storms would roll in like mountains of black cloud, split open by lightning that could strike without mercy. And yet, in this land of danger, the Lakota thrived. They were not always a horse culture. Before the arrival of the horse, brought to the continent by the Spanish and spread north through trade and capture, the Lakota hunted on foot, relying on stamina and cunning to bring down game. But once they mastered the horse, their way of life transformed almost overnight. The horse gave them range, speed, and the ability to follow the buffalo herds over hundreds of miles. And the buffalo, or tatanka, as the Lakota called them, were everything. They were food, shelter, clothing, tools, and fuel for fire. A single hunt could sustain a community for weeks. But more than that, the buffalo was sacred, bound to the Lakota's spiritual beliefs. To hunt them was not just a necessity, it was a relationship, a pact between the people and the land. This deep bond with their environment gave the Lakota both strength and purpose, but it also made them fiercely protective. When outsiders, trappers, settlers, soldiers, pushed into their territory, the Lakota saw it not just as an invasion of the land, but as a threat to the very rhythm of their existence. And when threatened, they responded with precision and ferocity. Lakota warfare was built on mobility and overwhelming force. Their warriors, known as Akichita, trained from boyhood. At an age when most children in settler towns were still learning to read, Lakota boys were already mastering the bow, learning to ride bareback, and practicing the art of hunting with both stealth and speed. By the time they were grown, these skills could be turned toward warfare with devastating effect. Like the Comanche, the Lakota became expert horse archers, able to fire with deadly accuracy at a full gallop. But they also adapted quickly to firearms, acquiring them through trade or capture and integrating them seamlessly into their tactics. A Lakota war party could appear over a ridge like a sudden storm, their horses' hooves pounding the earth, their weapons ready. They fought not just to defend themselves, but to send a message that their lands were not to be taken without a fight, and that message was delivered most powerfully in battles that echoed through history. One such story, told and retold, is the account of the Fetterman Fight in 1866. It was winter in Wyoming Territory, and tensions between the Lakota, their Cheyenne allies, and the US Army were already high. Fort Phil Kearny, built to protect travellers along the Bozeman Trail, stood in the heart of Lakota hunting grounds. The soldiers stationed there were under constant watch, their every movement tracked by unseen eyes. The Lakota leader Red Cloud understood the soldiers' weakness, pride and overconfidence. Working with warrior leaders like Crazy Horse, he planned an ambush. The bait would be a small group of Lakota riders, fast, agile, taunting the soldiers into chasing them. The trap would be set in the narrow valleys beyond, where hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors waited. On December 21st, a detachment of 81 soldiers under Captain William Fetterman took the bait. They pursued the riders, including Crazy Horse himself, further and further from the fort. The snow muffled the sound of hooves, the cold air sharpening every breath. When Fetterman's men reached the valley, the hills suddenly came alive. Warriors burst from cover on all sides, cutting off escape. The fight was brutal and swift. Within minutes, all 81 soldiers were dead, the worst military defeat on the Great Plains at that time. Not a single warrior's body was left behind. It was a masterclass in coordination, patience, and the use of the land as a weapon. The Lakota's reputation grew even more after the Great Sioux War of 1876, when leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall faced the full might of the US Army. That conflict would lead to perhaps the most famous Native American victory in history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In June of that year, thousands of Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies had gathered along the Little Bighorn River, following a vision Sitting Bull had received of soldiers falling into their camp like grasshoppers. When General George Armstrong Custer attacked, he believed he faced only a fraction of the warriors present. Instead, he charged headlong into a force several times the size of his own. The result was total destruction. Custer and more than 200 of his men were killed to the last. The battle shocked the nation, cementing the Lakota's image as warriors who could not only defend themselves, but defeat one of the most aggressive cavalry commanders of the era. But victory came at a cost. The US government responded with overwhelming force, sending more troops, cutting off supplies, and relentlessly pursuing the Lakota until many were forced onto reservations. Yet even in the face of loss, their legacy as defenders of their land remained unshaken. What made the Lakota so feared was not just their skill in battle, but their unity in defense of their way of life. Their leaders were chosen for their wisdom as much as their bravery. Decisions were made in council, with the welfare of the people always at the center. In times of peace, they were traders, hunters, and storytellers. In times of war, they became a storm sweeping across the plains. Even today, the Lakota are remembered not only for their victories, but for the principles that guided them: loyalty to their people, respect for the land, and an unyielding refusal to bow to any force that sought to erase them. And in the long tapestry of history, their name remains one of the most respected and feared among the tribes of North America. The Lakota were more than just warriors. They were a people shaped by the rhythm of the plains. Every aspect of their lives, from the way they hunted to the way they governed themselves, was intertwined with the vast, open world they called home. Life in a Lakota camp was a balance of hard labor, skill, and tradition. The day might begin before sunrise, when the air was still sharp and the prairie grass glistened with dew. Hunters would ride out in search of game, often travelling for hours before spotting the dark, moving mass of a buffalo herd in the distance. Tracking these animals required patience and an intimate knowledge of their patterns, when they would move, when they would rest, and how they might react to human presence. Women, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to prepare food, tan hides, and maintain the teepees that served as the centre of Lakota domestic life. These teepees, built from long lodgepole pines covered in buffalo hides, were both sturdy and portable. A skilled family could dismantle and pack one in under an hour, ready to follow the herds or move to safer ground if danger threatened. The portability of their homes was no small advantage. It meant the Lakota could shift entire communities quickly, never staying in one place long enough for enemies to corner them. This mobility was part of what made them so formidable in warfare. They didn't just fight battles, they could vanish into the plains and reappear miles away, reorganized and ready to strike again. Outsiders might think they had scattered in defeat, only to find themselves ambushed days later by warriors who seemed to emerge from the very earth. The Lakota's social structure also strengthened their resilience. Decisions weren't dictated by a single chief issuing commands from above. Instead, leadership was earned, often through acts of bravery and generosity. A man could become a respected leader not just by killing an enemy, but by protecting his people, ensuring they had food, and showing wisdom in negotiations. This created a system where authority was tied to respect, and respect had to be earned continually. Warriors trained not just for combat, but for honor. In Lakota culture, one of the highest forms of bravery was counting coup, touching an enemy in battle without killing them, then escaping unharmed. To do this required incredible courage and skill, proving to the community that the warrior was both fearless and clever. Their horses were not just tools of war, but almost extensions of the warriors themselves. A Lakota warrior could control his mount with his knees alone, leaving both hands free for bow, lance, or rifle. Horses were adorned with paint and feathers before battle, each marking carrying a story of past victories, spiritual visions, or blessings from the spirits. Some warriors believed the decorations could confuse enemies or bring supernatural protection. Spirituality infused every part of Lakota life. They believed in Wakantanka, the Great Mystery, a sacred force that flowed through all things. Visions, often sought through fasting and isolation, guided decisions in war and peace. Medicine men and women, respected for their connection to the spiritual world, played vital roles in healing both physical wounds and the unseen injuries of the soul. When it came to their reputation as feared warriors, it wasn't just about victories like Little Bighorn. Long before Custer's defeat, the Lakota had been expanding westward, pushing out rival tribes such as the Crow, Pawnee and Arikara. Their expansion wasn't random. They sought control of the best hunting grounds, the richest river valleys, and the most strategic passes. Every success reinforced their position as a dominant force on the plains, and every tribe they displaced became another testament to their strength. And yet, the Lakota were not mindless aggressors. Many conflicts began as defensive measures, retaliations against encroachments by other tribes, or later, by settlers and soldiers. But once provoked, the Lakota did not simply defend. They struck back with overwhelming force. Even US military commanders, accustomed to fighting in the dense forests of the East or the battlefields of the Civil War, found the Lakota a uniquely challenging enemy. They could not be pinned down in traditional set-piece battles. They chose the terrain, controlled the timing, and fought only when it gave them the greatest advantage. When they retreated, it was not in defeat, but to draw their enemy further into unfamiliar territory, where the land itself became a weapon. The psychological impact of facing the Lakota cannot be overstated. Soldiers and settlers alike spoke of the terrifying moment when a war cry would split the air, followed by the thunder of hooves. Warriors, painted in bright colours and adorned with eagle feathers, would seem to explode over a ridge or from the cover of grass, riding directly at their enemies. In those moments, the speed, noise, and sheer ferocity of the attack could shatter even disciplined lines. One striking aspect of Lakota warfare was their ability to unite with other tribes when necessary. While old rivalries with the Cheyenne or Arapaho existed, these could be set aside when facing a greater threat. This ability to forge alliances on the battlefield created forces that could overwhelm even heavily armed opponents. Even after the tragedies of the reservation era, the forced relocations, the loss of buffalo herds, the suppression of traditional ceremonies, the spirit of the Lakota endured. Their history became a source of pride for future generations, a reminder of a time when they rode as free people, feared and respected across a continent. Today, the names of Lakota leaders still carry weight. Crazy Horse, whose very name struck fear into enemies. Sitting Bull, the spiritual leader whose visions inspired victory. Gall, the tactician whose timing at Little Bighorn helped seal Custer's fate. These men were more than warriors. They were symbols of a people's determination to remain themselves in a world that sought to erase them. The Lakota did not simply survive on the plains. They owned them, in both the physical and the spiritual sense. Their enemies learned that to fight them was to fight not just individual warriors, but an entire culture bound together by kinship, faith, and the unshakable belief that their land and way of life were worth any sacrifice. And so their legend endures, as swift as the wind on the grasslands, as unyielding as the Black Hills, and as eternal as the stories told around their fires. The Lakota were not merely a people of war, but a people of balance, bound by kinship, guided by tradition, and shaped by the vast sweep of the plains. To understand why they were feared, you must first understand how they were made. From the moment a Lakota child could walk, life began as a lesson in resilience. Boys learned to ride before they could fully speak in sentences, gripping a pony's mane and feeling the sway of the animal beneath them as naturally as their own heartbeat. They were taught to shoot small bows at first, practicing with blunt arrows at targets of grass and hide, their accuracy honed long before they were allowed to join the hunts. Girls, meanwhile, were entrusted with tasks that carried the very survival of the tribe, learning to tan hide so they could withstand wind and rain, to sew clothing strong enough for travel, and to prepare dried meat and pemmican that could sustain a family through the lean months. Strength and skill were not just physical qualities, they were moral expectations. A boy who excelled in the hunt, but was selfish in sharing his meat, would be judged harshly, while a young woman whose sewing was not yet perfect could still earn admiration if her work showed care for her people. This early shaping created adults who placed the needs of the tribe above their own desires, an ethic that would carry into war and diplomacy alike. It is deep winter on the northern plains, the kind where the wind slices through furs and turns the inside of your nose to ice. Snow blankets the land in white silence, stretching in every direction until it meets the low, grey sky. The rivers are frozen solid, the grass brittle beneath the crust of frost. In this frozen world, movement is slow, sound carries far, and the cold is an enemy all its own. For the Lakota, winter is not a time of idleness. It is a time of opportunity. When rival tribes or enemy forts grow complacent in the cold, warriors strike, knowing the snow can hide their approach, and the bitter wind can sap their foe's strength before the first arrow flies. Tonight, the camp is quiet, hidden in a drawer where the wind's howl cannot reach. Fires burn low under buffalo hide shelters, their smoke thin and discreet. Horses are kept close, their warm breath steaming into the dark. In the shadows, warriors prepare. Thick buffalo robes are cinched tight over painted buckskin, and fur-lined moccasins are tied firmly against the snow. Weapons are checked, rifles cleaned and loaded, bows strung, lances sharpened. The target lies to the north, a small band of Pawnee wintering near the bend of a frozen creek. Scouts have watched them for days, noting their routines, the location of their horses and the watch patterns of their sentries. Now, the Lakota plan to strike before dawn, when the cold is sharpest and the enemy's fires burn low. The war party moves silently across the snow. Ponies tread lightly, their hooves muffled by the powder. Breath fogs in the moonlight, But no one speaks. Every sound, the creak of leather, the soft clink of metal, feels loud in the stillness. The only rhythm is the slow, steady beat of hooves and the crunch of snow under moccasins. When they reach the last rise before the Pawnee camp, the warriors dismount. Some slip forward on foot, keeping low, their robes blending with the night. They can see the glow of faint embers through the tippies, the silhouettes of sleeping forms, and the darker shapes of horses huddled together for warmth. The signal comes, a sharp, high-pitched cry that splits the silence like a blade. In an instant the night erupts. Warriors surge forward, weapons flashing in the firelight as startled shouts rise from the Pawnee camp. Horses whinny in panic, their hooves pounding against the frozen ground. Some Lakota cut the rawhide ropes holding the Pawnees' mounts, driving them toward the waiting riders. Others clash with the waking warriors, the fight swift and brutal. In the cold, even small wounds are dangerous. Blood freezes in seconds, breath turns to steam that blinds the eyes. Within minutes, the raid is done. The Pawnee are scattered, some fleeing into the dark, others lying still in the snow. The Lakota mount up, driving the stolen horses ahead of them, their victory cries carrying far across the frozen plains. But the cold has not forgotten them. The return is just as dangerous as the fight. Frost creeps into fingers and toes, the wind biting through every gap in their robes. They ride hard, knowing that even a successful raid can be a death sentence if the cold claims them before they reach the warmth of their own fires. By the time they return to camp, the eastern horizon is blushing with the first light of dawn. Horses are tied and rubbed down, the stolen herd penned close. The warriors gather around the fires, their faces still raw from the wind, steam curling from their clothes as the heat thaws the night's frost. This is winter warfare, as much a battle against nature as against any enemy. The Lakota have mastered it, turning the season's hardships into weapons, striking when others would hide. To them the snow is not an obstacle, it is an ally. Where the rolling grasslands of the Great Plains meet the winding rivers and scattered groves of cottonwood, there once rode another force to be reckoned with, the Cheyenne. To outsiders their name carried a mix of awe and dread. To friends they were loyal beyond measure, to enemies they were a storm that came without warning. The Cheyenne had not always been people of the plains. Long ago they lived far to the north, in the wooded river valleys of what is now Minnesota and the Dakotas. They were farmers then, growing corn, beans and squash, living in earth lodges and fishing the streams. But the coming of the horse, and the slow push of rival tribes and settlers, set them on a new path. Over generations they abandoned their farmlands and took to the open grass country, trading the plough for the bow and lance, the earth lodge for the teepee. And with that transformation, they became some of the most skilled mounted warriors the plains would ever see. Among the Cheyenne, war was not mindless violence. It was bound by complex traditions, spiritual beliefs, and codes of honor. Raids were often as much about prestige as plunder, and a man's bravery could be measured not just by the enemies he killed, but by the daring acts he performed in battle, touching a live foe with his co-stick, riding between two enemy warriors, or stealing horses from the very heart of an enemy camp. What made the Cheyenne so formidable was the way they combined discipline with speed. They were organized in soldier societies, each with its own duties, songs, and regalia. Among them, the most feared was the Dog Soldiers, a society whose members swore to fight to the death rather than retreat. In the chaos of battle, Dog Soldiers could turn the tide by sheer willpower, planting their decorated sash in the ground and holding that position no matter the odds. The sight of one, standing unmoving while the fight raged around him, was both terrifying and inspiring. Their raids were lightning strikes. Cheyenne scouts could cover miles in a day, mapping the location of rival camps or military outposts. At night, warriors would ride low over the grass, their ponies' hoofbeats muffled, their bodies blending into the shadows. When the moment came, they descended in a blur of shouting voices, flashing steel and pounding hooves, a wave of fury that was gone almost as fast as it came, leaving confusion in its wake. But the Cheyenne were not just warriors. They were traders, diplomats, and keepers of sacred traditions. They carried the sacred arrows, said to be given to them by the prophet's sweet medicine. These arrows were not just symbols, they were the heart of Cheyenne identity, believed to protect the tribe and bring success in war and hunting. Their renewal ceremonies, held in the most solemn of gatherings, bound the people together in shared purpose. As the 1800s wore on, their world grew more dangerous. Pressure came not only from rival tribes like the Lakota and Crow, but increasingly from US expansion. At first, the Cheyenne traded with the newcomers, exchanging buffalo robes for guns, beads, and iron tools. But trade gave way to tension to conflict, and conflict to bloodshed. One of the most harrowing episodes came in the mid-19th century, when bands of Cheyenne, some still willing to negotiate, others determined to resist, found themselves drawn into a series of escalating wars with the United States. The Cheyenne fought brilliantly, using the plains to their advantage, disappearing into the grass after striking at military convoys and settlements. But the enemy they faced was relentless, able to bring more men, more supplies, and more firepower with each campaign. Even in the face of such odds, the Cheyenne refused to be broken easily. At the Battle of Beecher Island in 1868, a force of mostly dog soldiers besieged a group of US Army scouts stranded on a sandbar in the Aracari River. The Cheyenne charged again and again over several days, pressing so close that bullets struck the very water around the defenders. Though they eventually withdrew, the courage and ferocity they showed left a deep mark on all who survived. Yet the Cheyenne story is not only one of war, it is also one of heartbreak. Villages were burned, families scattered, sacred objects lost to the flames of conflict. The massacre at Sand Creek in 1864, where Colorado militia slaughtered over 100 Cheyenne, many of them women and children, scarred the people deeply, setting off a cycle of vengeance that would fuel the wars for years to come. And still, through it all, the Cheyenne endured. Their songs carried the memory of battles and fallen warriors, their ceremonies kept alive the spirit of their ancestors, and their stories reminded each new generation that they were part of something larger. A people who had crossed from the forests to the plains, from farmers to warriors, and had met the storms of history head-on. It was the deep hours before dawn when the call went out through the camp. The fire in the council lodge had burned low, casting only a faint orange glow against the leather walls. Outside, the night was clear and sharp, the air so cold it seemed to crack when you breathed. The warriors gathered silently, their shadows long under the sliver of moon. The chief spoke in low voices, pointing toward the west. Somewhere beyond those dark hills, a rival band's horses grazed in a river valley, a prize worth risking lives for. Every man knew his place. The dog soldiers took the lead, their coup sticks wrapped in feathers and bright cloth, swaying slightly in the wind. Faces were painted, some in black for war, others in red for power. Each design was personal, a prayer for speed, strength, or protection. We rode out before first light. The ponies' hooves barely made a sound in the frost-hardened grass, their breath steaming in great plumes. A scout at the front raised his hand. We stopped, listening. The land was so still that you could hear the distant trickle of a stream, the faint creak of saddle leather, and somewhere ahead the muffled snort of horses. We slipped from our mounts and moved forward on foot. Through the low brush, the enemy's camp came into view. Teepees arranged in a wide circle, a thin trail of smoke rising from a few dying fires. Just beyond, the herd, at least 60 head, their shapes barely visible against the pale horizon. The dog soldiers spread out, moving like shadows. The signal came, a hawk's call sharp and quick. We sprang into motion. I remember the sudden explosion of sound, warriors shouting, ponies whinnying, hooves pounding against frozen earth. Some rushed the camp, firing arrows into the air to scatter the sleepers, while others, myself among them, broke toward the herd. The horses, startled awake, surged together in a panicked mass. We drove them hard, cutting through the snow with our ponies, swinging rawhide ropes to turn the led animals toward home. Behind us, the camp erupted in confusion. Men stumbled out with weapons in hand, but the Cheyenne were already everywhere, darting between teepees, stealing mounts, vanishing into the dark edges of the prairie. One man, a dog soldier, rode straight into the heart of the camp, leaping from his pony to strike an enemy warrior with his coup stick, before vaulting back into the saddle. His shout rose above the chaos, a sound of pure defiance. We pushed the stolen herd fast, knowing that speed was our only shield. The cold air burned in my lungs and the snow stung my face as we rode. Behind us, the faint sounds of pursuit faded into nothing. The herd, once terrified, now moved together under our control, driven on by the rhythmic pounding of hooves. By the time the sun rose, the stolen horses were within sight of our own camp. Women and children came running, their shouts mixing with the songs of the warriors. The elders would count this raid among the great ones, not just for the number of horses taken, but for the way it had been done, swift, disciplined, and without a single Cheyenne life lost. That night, the fires burned high. The sacred arrows were honoured, and the warriors told the story again and again, each time with more vivid detail. The flash of an enemy spear in the firelight, the deep black eyes of a stolen stallion, the sound of hooves carrying the people's fortune back home. For the Cheyenne, such raids were not merely acts of war or theft. They were lifeblood, a test of courage, a gift to the people, and a thread in the endless fabric of their history. The wind was a living thing that morning. It did not blow so much as it cut, slicing through fur, leather, and flesh alike. The sky was the colour of iron, heavy with the promise of more snow. Out on the frozen prairie, sound carried for miles, so the Cheyenne war party moved like phantoms, their ponies' hooves wrapped in strips of buffalo hide to muffle their tread. It had been a hard winter. The buffalo herds had wandered further south, and food was growing scarce. Across the river to the north, a hostile band, Pawnee scouts they thought, had been seen near the hunting grounds. The Cheyenne could not let them stay. If the Pawnee controlled that stretch of river, the game would vanish, and with it the tribe's survival. The war chief, an older dog soldier named White Elk, rode at the front, his buffalo hide robe pulled tight against the cold. His breath rose in clouds as he looked over his warriors, 20 men, each wrapped in layers of fur and wool, faces streaked with black paint that cut across cheekbones like shadows. They advanced in silence until the frozen river came into view. It was half covered in wind-blown snow, the ice beneath it a faint glassy blue. Across the water, in the shelter of a low ridge, they could see the faint shapes of teepees and the black dots of men tending fires. White Elk signalled, and the warriors dismounted, leading their ponies along a shallow bend in the river until they found a crossing point. The ice groaned under their weight but held, each step ringing faintly in the cold air. Once across, they fanned out into the cover of willow and cottonwood trees. Snow crunched softly under moccasins, but the wind's howl masked the sound. The attack began with a soundless motion, a single arrow, loosed from the shadows, striking a sentry in the chest before he could shout. The second arrow came a heartbeat later, then the third, and then the quiet shattered. Cheyenne warriors burst from the trees, their war cries rising in a piercing chorus. Arrows hissed through the air, thudding into shields, striking the frozen earth, splintering against teepee poles. Pawnee warriors scrambled to grab weapons, some barely awake, others already charging forward with spears in hand. White Elk led the first rush. His coup stick, wrapped in red-dyed horsehair, struck a Pawnee warrior across the shoulder before he could draw his bow. A second Cheyenne swept in behind him, swinging a war club that connected with a sickening crack. Snow was churned into clouds beneath pounding hooves as mounted warriors wheeled through the fight, loosing arrows at near point-blank range. Horses screamed, arrows embedded in their flanks, and men fought in a whirl of flashing steel and flying snow. I remember one young Cheyenne, barely more than a boy, who leapt from his pony to wrestle a Pawnee to the ground, both of them rolling in the snow until the Cheyenne emerged on top, driving a knife downward in a single final motion. The Pawnee fought fiercely, their own cries ringing through the wind, but the Cheyenne pressed them hard, pushing them back toward the frozen ridge. Some tried to make a stand near the camp's central fire, but White Elk and his dog soldiers broke through their line like a hammer through ice. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the snow was trampled and stained, the fires knocked over and smoking in the bitter wind. The Cheyenne drove off the surviving Pawnee, leaving them scattered in the drifts, and claimed their spoils: weapons, blankets, and most importantly, horses. But it was not over yet. The return journey was brutal. The wind had risen, driving icy needles into exposed skin. The stolen horses resisted, skittish and panicked, but the warriors pressed on, knowing that stopping too long in the open could mean death. By nightfall, they reached the safety of a low hill where the snow lay deep but the wind was gentler. Fires were built, their light flickering against snowbanks. Warriors tended wounds in silence, the sound of boiling water and crackling wood the only comfort. The next day, when they rode into the Cheyenne camp, the people gathered to greet them. The war songs rose, mingling with the whinny of the stolen horses. Elders came forward to count coup, marking the deeds done in the fight. Each blow struck, each enemy unhorsed, each act of bravery was remembered and told. This was the way of the Cheyenne. Even in the dead of winter, even against cold and hunger, they would not yield their ground. It was in the late summer, when the air was thick with the smell of ripening prairie grass, and the buffalo herd stretched across the horizon like a living sea, that the Cheyenne joined forces with the Lakota for a campaign that would be spoken of for generations. The target was a fortified Crow encampment deep in the Yellowstone country. The Crow had been raiding both tribes' hunting grounds, driving away the game and stealing horses. By themselves, the Cheyenne could have fought them, and likely won, but together with the Lakota, the plan was to crush the Crow so completely that they would not return for years. From every direction, warriors began to gather. Cheyenne dog soldiers rode in from the south, their coup sticks decorated with feathers that streamed behind them in the wind. Lakota horsemen thundered in from the east, painted in bold red and black, their hair braided and tied with strips of otter fur. Around the campfires at night the leaders met, the Cheyenne war chief Iron Shirt and the Lakota chief Red Cloud, each laying out the plan in voices low and measured. The attack would come at dawn. The night before the battle, the Alliance camp was alive with the ritual. Cheyenne warriors prepared their shields, rubbing them with sacred earth and painting them with symbols of protection: thunderbirds, sunbursts, and streaks of lightning. Lakota men sang war songs that echoed off the low hills, their rhythm carried by the steady beat of drums. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. When the first light touched the horizon, the warriors mounted. The combined force numbered nearly 400, a sight to make even the bravest hesitate. They moved in a wide arc surrounding the Crow village so that no escape was possible. The first signal came from the Cheyenne side, a long rising war cry that cut through the morning stillness like an arrow. From the other flank, the Lakota answered, their shouts swelling until it seemed the entire prairie roared. The Crow were ready, but they had not expected such numbers. They fought back hard, loosing arrows in dense volleys from behind their fortifications. The first wave of Cheyenne took the brunt of it, shields raised, ponies weaving and dodging as arrows splintered against rawhide. Then the Lakota charged from the opposite side. Horses plunged through the tall grass, warriors leaning low and loosing arrows at full gallop. Smoke began to rise as fires caught in the Crow camp. The battle was chaos, riders darting in and out, warriors leaping from their horses to fight hand to hand, the smell of sweat and smoke mixing with the metallic tang of blood. One Cheyenne dog soldier, refusing to retreat even when wounded, stood his ground in the open, daring the enemy to face him. Lakota warriors broke through a section of the defences and poured into the camp, clashing with Crow fighters in a frenzy of shouting, flashing steel and pounding hooves. It was over by midday. The Crow were driven out entirely, leaving behind their camp and most of their horses. The Alliance forces rounded up the captured animals, their manes whipping in the hot wind, and gathered what supplies they could carry. When they returned to their own lands, the story of the great Cheyenne-Lakota victory spread quickly. It was not just a triumph of arms, but a warning to any who might threaten their hunting grounds. Together, they had shown that the plains could unite, and when they did, their power was unstoppable. The smoke of that great victory still drifted in memory when the winds of the plains shifted again. Alliances were powerful, but they were fleeting, and on the western edge of the Great Plains, beyond the mountains and into the high plateaus, lived a people whose strength came not from numbers or speed, but from an almost unshakable unity. They were fierce, unyielding, and deeply bound to the earth they walked on. These were the Nez Perce. Their homeland stretched across what is now Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, a land of tumbling rivers, endless pine forests, and rolling valleys where the earth was rich and black. Unlike the Comanche or the Cheyenne, the Nez Perce were not nomads in the purest sense. They moved with the seasons, yes, but always within the boundaries of their ancestral domain. Theirs was a land of salmon runs so plentiful that the riverbanks would shimmer silver in the spawning season, and of high mountain meadows where the wind smelled of wildflowers and snowmelt. They were horse people too. In fact, the Nez Perce were among the finest breeders on the continent. Their Appaloosa horses were strong, sure-footed, and remarkably fast over long distances. A Nez Perce rider could vanish into the broken hills and reappear miles away before his pursuers even caught sight of him again. And unlike many tribes who adopted horses from others, the Nez Perce shaped their herds with careful selection, creating animals uniquely suited to their style of life and war. Yet for all their skill, the Nez Perce were not constantly at war. They fought when they had to, and when they did, they fought with a precision and discipline that shocked their enemies. They believed in defending their homeland above all else, and to strike at the Nez Perce in their own territory was to awaken a storm that could not easily be contained. One of their greatest strengths was their intimate knowledge of the land. Rivers became barriers, canyons became traps, and mountain passes became ambush sites. Their warriors moved silently through the forests, using the shadows and terrain to their advantage. A single Nez Perce scout could track a raiding party for days without being seen, then guide his people to strike at exactly the right moment. But their story is perhaps best remembered through one of the most remarkable campaigns in Native American history. A flight across nearly 1,200 miles of rugged terrain, pursued by one of the most determined military forces the United States could muster. It began in the summer of 1877, when tensions between the Nez Perce and the US government reached a breaking point. Ordered to leave their homeland and move to a reservation, several Nez Perce bands refused. A series of violent clashes erupted, and soon the tribe, men, women and children alike, found themselves fleeing not just from soldiers, but from the end of their way of life. What followed was not a desperate scramble, but a fighting retreat of astonishing skill. Again and again, the Nez Perce fought rearguard actions, holding off superior numbers while their people and herds moved ahead. They crossed rivers under fire, scaled mountains that others thought impassable, and outmaneuvered the army at nearly every turn. Perhaps the most famous of these battles was the one at the Big Hole in Montana. In the pale light before dawn, soldiers attacked the Nez Perce camp, hoping to end the campaign in a single blow, but the warriors rallied, fighting back with a ferocity that drove the soldiers to the edge of collapse. Though the Nez Perce suffered terrible losses that day, they escaped yet again, slipping away into the mountains and continuing their long flight toward the Canadian border. For months, they fought and ran, their horses carrying them across some of the harshest landscapes in the West. Every river crossing, every canyon descent, every sudden stand was another act of defiance. In the end, they came within just 40 miles of Canada before exhaustion, hunger, and the bitter cold forced them to stop. Surrounded and outnumbered, Chief Joseph surrendered, but his words that day carried the weight of a people's pride and grief. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. Even in defeat, the Nez Perce had shown the world what determination, skill and unity could achieve. They had fought one of the most extraordinary military withdrawals in history, and had earned the respect of both allies and enemies alike. The story of the Nez Perce was one of endurance and masterful strategy, but far to the north, in the wide expanse where endless forests met the frozen edge of the prairie, lived a people whose identity was bound to the very cycles of the seasons. They thrived in a land where winter could lock the earth in silence for months at a time, and where survival demanded not only skill, but a deep, almost spiritual relationship with the land itself. These were the Cree. The Cree were not a single, tightly clustered nation, but a vast network of bands spread across what is now Canada, from the woodlands of Ontario and Manitoba to the sweeping plains of Saskatchewan and Alberta. Their adaptability was legendary. Some Cree were woodland hunters, moving silently through the forests in search of moose, beaver and caribou. Others became skilled horsemen and bison hunters after the great herds swept north, trading their snowshoes for saddles when the seasons and resources demanded it. What made the Cree so formidable was not only their ability to survive in such varied environments, but their mastery of alliances and trade. Long before European powers set foot in their lands, the Cree had established vast trade routes, connecting distant tribes in a network of goods, news, and kinship. They were diplomats as much as they were warriors, able to negotiate peace when it served them, and to wage relentless war when it didn't. In the era of fur trading, the Cree became indispensable middlemen between European traders and other native nations. This brought them wealth, new tools, and powerful weapons, but it also drew them into the dangerous web of colonial rivalries. The Cree quickly learned to balance these relationships, playing French, British, and later Canadian authorities against one another to protect their own interests. Yet when their land, hunting grounds, or people were threatened, the Cree could be fierce beyond measure. Their warriors moved swiftly, often striking in winter when their enemies least expected it. Snowshoes allowed them to travel over deep drifts with ease, and sleds pulled by trained dogs carried supplies over great distances. Winter was not a season of rest for the Cree, it was a weapon. One of their most feared tactics was the deep winter raid. An enemy village might believe itself safe under the cover of snow and cold, but Cree warriors could travel for days in freezing temperatures, carrying only the essentials, moving silently through moonlit forests. They would arrive at dawn or in the dead of night, attacking with precision before melting back into the white wilderness, leaving behind only their strange, webbed tracks in the snow. The Cree were also known for their strong spiritual traditions, which infused every aspect of their lives. The land, the animals, the seasons, all were part of a living web of relationships, and to violate that balance was to court disaster. Ceremonies, songs, and oral histories were passed down through generations, keeping their identity alive even as the outside world pressed in. Their history is full of leaders whose names still carry weight. One of the most famous was Big Bear, a chief who sought to unite the Plains Cree into a single strong voice against the encroachment of settlers and the tightening grip of government control. He was a skilled orator, capable of holding his people together through persuasion and wisdom rather than sheer force. But when conflict became unavoidable, the Cree fought with the same cunning and ferocity that had kept them strong for centuries. The Battle of Cut Knife in 1885 is one such moment, a confrontation during the Northwest Rebellion, in which a Cree and Assiniboine force, outnumbered and under siege, managed to repel Canadian troops through superior positioning and disciplined fire. It was a victory that showed that even in the face of modern weaponry and organised armies, the Cree's knowledge of their land and their ability to fight as one could still carry the day. In the end, like so many tribes, the Cree would face broken treaties, displacement, and the pressures of a changing world. But their adaptability, the same skill that let them thrive from deep forest to open prairie, would remain their greatest strength. They were survivors, traders, warriors, and diplomats, moving through history with the quiet confidence of a people who had outlasted both enemies and empires. It begins in silence. The air is sharp enough to sting the lungs, the kind of cold that freezes breath into tiny crystals that hang in the air. A thin crescent moon rides high above the snow-covered forest, casting pale light over a world made of silver and shadow. In the stillness, a line of dark figures moves between the trees. Cree warriors, gliding over the drifts on snowshoes, their sleds whispering behind them. They have been travelling for 2 days through sub-zero winds, following a route known only to the oldest hunters. No fires have been lit, no voices raised above a whisper. They move with the economy of men who have done this before, who know that the forest itself can betray them with the crack of an icy branch or the call of a startled bird. Somewhere to the south, beyond the frozen bend of a river and a stretch of wind-scoured prairie, lies their destination, a rival band's winter encampment. The two peoples have been in a tense cycle of retribution for seasons now. A horse stolen here, a hunting party ambushed there. This raid is not meant to end the conflict, but to send a message. By the third night, the warriors are close enough to smell wood smoke on the wind. They pause in the shelter of a cedar grove, crouched low as their leader, an older warrior named Mr. Himasqua, Great Bear, studies the faint glow on the horizon. He raises a gloved hand, signalling the final approach. The warriors fan out, moving in silence over the snow. Every step is placed with care. In the distance, the enemy camp sleeps, lodges half buried in snow, the faint orange flicker of banked fires glowing through thin hide walls. Dogs lie curled near the entrances, their ears twitching but their bodies too cold and tired to rise. Then, with the precision of a hawk striking from the dark, the Cree descend. The first move is to cut the tether lines on the horses, an act as crippling as any wound in winter. A small group slips into the shadows near the corral, knives flashing in the moonlight as they sever ropes and slap the animals into a panicked stampede. The sudden noise wakes the dogs, whose barking shatters the stillness and rouses the camp. By then, the second group has moved in, pulling back lodge flaps and driving their enemies into the snow. There is shouting now, the high, raw sound of men caught between sleep and fear. Spears and bows appear in the firelight, but the Cree press the attack with disciplined ferocity, their snowshoes giving them an edge in mobility as their opponents flounder in deep drifts. A young Cree warrior named Wapiska takes an arrow through his coat sleeve, a graze, but he doesn't stop. He plunges forward, knocking his foe into the snow and wrenching away his weapon. Around him, the camp is chaos. The hiss of arrows, the thud of club against shield, the heavy breathing of men in close combat. The raid lasts no more than minutes. By the time the enemy begins to mount a counterattack, Mr. Himasqua calls the retreat. The Cree vanish into the forest, driving their newly captured horses ahead of them, sleds laden with supplies. The snow quickly swallows their tracks, and the wind erases the sound of their passing. By dawn they are miles away, stopping only to rest the animals and share a silent meal of frozen meat. No one speaks of the raid yet. That will come later, when they return to their own lodges and the elders listen. For now they move on through the endless white, their breath steaming in the morning air, knowing the message has been delivered. The snow will tell no stories, but the rival band will remember, and that, in the Cree way of war, is victory enough. Our next tribe, the Blackfoot, called themselves the Niitsitapi, the real people, and for centuries they were the dominant power of the northern plains. Their world was a land of vast grass seas, rolling under skies so wide it felt as though the earth had no end. To outsiders it was an unforgiving wilderness. To the Blackfoot it was home, and they knew every bend in the river, every ridge that offered shelter from the relentless wind, every path the bison herds would take. Their confederacy was made of three main nations, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, bound together by blood, language, and an unyielding sense of identity. They were not a people who simply survived in the plains. They ruled them. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, their influence stretched from the North Saskatchewan River in what is now Canada, deep into the upper Missouri country of the United States. Anyone who entered their territory without permission did so at great risk. One of the secrets of their power lay in their mastery of mobility. Long before horses, the Blackfoot had been formidable hunters and warriors, travelling with dog-drawn travois and moving their camps with remarkable speed. But when the horse entered their world, they transformed into something far more dangerous. They became a cavalry nation, able to move entire villages across hundreds of miles in days to strike swiftly and vanish before an enemy could muster a defence. Unlike the Cree, whose territories bled into the forests and lake country, the Blackfoot were creatures of open space. Their skill in reading the land was unmatched. They could track a herd from a week-old trail, anticipate storms by the smell of the air, and use the wind itself as cover for their movements. Their warfare was both brutal and strategic. They were relentless in defending their territory, particularly against the Assiniboine, the Crow, and later the Cree, with whom they waged long and bitter wars. Raids were meticulously planned. Scouts sent ahead to monitor enemy movement, warriors travelling light to maximise speed, and attacks timed for the greatest possible advantage. There is a story, often told among their descendants, of a summer when the Blackfoot struck deep into enemy lands in what is now Montana. The target was a Crow village, swollen with horses and trade goods after a successful season of hunting. The Blackfoot had been watching them for days from the hills, moving only at night to avoid detection. The attack came at dawn, when the first fingers of light were stretching over the plains. A sudden thunder of hooves announced their charge, hundreds of warriors sweeping in like a living tide. Arrows filled the air, and the Crow, caught half-prepared, scrambled to mount their horses and fight back. The battle raged across the grasslands, the two forces wheeling and breaking apart in swirling combat. In the end, the Blackfoot withdrew, taking with them dozens of horses and leaving a scar on the Crow that would not heal for seasons to come. But the Blackfoot did not live by war alone. Their lives were woven deeply into the cycles of the bison, which provided them with nearly everything they needed: meat for food, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings. The great communal bison hunts were as much a part of their strength as their military skill. To see a Blackfoot hunt in full motion was to watch an entire society move as one. Scouts guiding the herd into position, riders driving the animals toward hidden coulees or over the edge of a carefully chosen buffalo jump, where the plunge meant instant death and a bounty of resources for the people. The Blackfoot were also guardians of stories, songs and ceremonies that bound their generations together. The Okayan, or sun dance, was one of their most important traditions. a time of renewal, sacrifice, and reaffirmation of their connection to the land and the Creator. In their worldview, power was not simply the ability to conquer an enemy, but to maintain harmony with the world that sustained them. Yet, like all great powers of the plains, the Blackfoot's supremacy brought them into constant conflict. The arrival of European traders and firearms shifted the balance between tribes. Diseases, brought from far-off places, cut deep into their numbers. The expansion of settler frontiers pushed them into harder wars, not just against traditional enemies, but against a force that seemed to have no end. Still, in the time before that tide became unstoppable, the Blackfoot Confederacy stood as a wall of will and skill, fierce, proud, and unbroken. They were a people who understood that in the open plains speed was life, knowledge was power, and to let one's guard down for even a moment could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. And when the stories of the old wars are told, the name of the Blackfoot is spoken with the same reverence and caution as the Comanche, Apache, or Lakota, for to face them on their own land was to face the wind itself, unseen until it was upon you, and impossible to stop. Winter on the northern plains was a season that tested every breath, every step, every decision. The winds howled down from the mountains, carrying with them a cold so sharp it seemed to slice through the very bones. Snow drifted across the grasslands, erasing landmarks, muffling sound, turning the world into a silent white ocean. It was in this harshest of times that the Blackfoot often struck their enemies, knowing that the cold could be as much a weapon as the bow or the lance. One story tells of a raid against the Assiniboine, carried out in the depth of a bitter winter. The Blackfoot war party had travelled for days, wrapped in buffalo robes, their horses' nostrils steaming in the freezing air. At night, they huddled in shallow coulees or behind snowdrifts, building small fires of twisted sagebrush, careful to shield the light from prying eyes. Hunger gnawed at them, and the ice cracked beneath their moccasins, but the warriors pressed forward, driven by duty and by the promise of honour. At last they reached their target, an Assiniboine camp tucked in a bend of a frozen river. From the ridges above, the Blackfoot could see the faint glow of fires flickering beneath the lodges, the dark silhouettes of horses tethered near the edge of camp. The air was still, heavy, and every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of snow beneath a foot, the distant creak of a frozen tree branch. The attack began before dawn. Blackfoot scouts crept silently down the slopes, their breath clouding the air, bows drawn and ready. Then came the rush, a sudden burst of motion, war cries ripping through the night like thunder, horses galloping down the frozen riverbank. The Assiniboine awoke in chaos, scrambling to mount bareback, weapons clutched hastily in cold, stiffened hands. The battle was fierce and desperate. Arrows hissed through the icy air, lances thrust in close combat, and the clash of bodies rang out across the snowbound camp. Horses screamed, their hooves striking sparks against frozen earth. The glow of firelight danced wildly across the lodges as warriors fought hand to hand, blades flashing in the dark. For the Blackfoot, the cold was an ally. Their raid had been timed so that their enemies were sluggish from winter hunger, their ponies weaker and less swift. The Blackfoot themselves had trained for this, running long distances in the snow as children, hardening their bodies against the freeze, learning how to keep their weapons from icing over. They fought with the strength of those who knew that retreat meant death, for to be caught in the open plains without supplies in winter was a sentence as cruel as any enemy's blade. When the fight ended, the Blackfoot withdrew into the storm, driving before them a captured herd of horses. They left behind a camp in ruins, their enemies humbled, their own honour burnished in the eyes of their people. The snow fell heavy that morning, covering the tracks of their escape, erasing the signs of battle until it seemed as though the plains themselves had swallowed the struggle whole. These winter raids were not just about war, they were tests of endurance, of cunning, of the spirit's ability to overcome the land itself. To succeed in them was to prove that a warrior was more than just strong. He was clever, disciplined, and blessed with the favour of the spirits. And so the Blackfoot thrived, even in the harshest season, shaping the cold and the snow into tools of war. Where others saw only hardship, they saw opportunity. The memory of these raids echoed through generations, told around lodge fires as lessons for the young, that the strength of the Blackfoot was not only in their weapons but in their will, their unity, and their ability to turn the very elements into allies. The year was remembered in Blackfoot winter counts as the time when many enemies gathered together, and the plains shook with war cries. The Cree and the Assiniboine, long rivals of the Blackfoot, had joined forces with their Sioux allies to launch a sweeping raid into Blackfoot territory. Such alliances were rare but dangerous, for when three peoples combined, they brought with them hundreds of warriors, enough to overwhelm even the strongest camp. The Blackfoot, however, were not unprepared. Scouts had carried word of the enemy days before, racing across the frozen prairies to warn the tribal leaders. Councils were called, pipes smoked, and decisions made. Messengers rode to the allied tribes of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Bloods and the Piegans, summoning their warriors. Soon the plains themselves seemed to stir as hundreds of horsemen converged, streaming across snowy ridges to gather under a single cause, the defence of their homeland. The morning of battle dawned grey and cold. Snow blanketed the plains, and the breath of men and horses plumed in great white clouds. On one side of the valley stretched the enemy force, their lodges clustered behind them, warriors painted for war, their feathers and weapons bright against the snow. On the other side, the Blackfoot Confederacy assembled, mounted on restless ponies, lances raised like a forest of spears. The two armies faced each other in silence for a long moment, broken only by the snort of a horse or the creak of leather. Then, with a great cry, the first charge began. Blackfoot riders surged forward, their ponies kicking up plumes of snow, arrows whistling into the enemy ranks. The Cree and Assiniboine responded in kind, loosing their own arrows, and soon the valley erupted into a chaos of movement, sound, and fury. The Blackfoot fought with precision born of unity. War chiefs directed charges with piercing whistles, while groups of riders wheeled in disciplined arcs, striking and retreating before the enemy could counter. Young warriors tested themselves by riding close to enemy lines, touching their opponents with coup sticks before darting away, a show of bravery that both honoured tradition and spread fear among their foes. The fighting raged through the day, waves of mounted warriors colliding, separating, then clashing again. Horses screamed, men fell, weapons flashed in the weak winter sun. At times the snow itself seemed alive, churned to mud and ice by the fury of hooves. What gave the Blackfoot the edge was not only their numbers, but their knowledge of the land. They lured their enemies into low ground where the snow was deep and the footing treacherous. As the Cree and Assiniboine struggled to manoeuvre, the Blackfoot struck with crushing force, circling them, cutting them off, and driving them back against their own lines. By afternoon, the tide had turned. The enemy began to falter, their unity unravelling under the relentless pressure. One by one, groups of warriors broke away, retreating across the snowbound plains. The Sioux, seeing their allies scatter, withdrew as well, leaving behind a field littered with fallen warriors and abandoned weapons. The Blackfoot stood victorious. They had faced an alliance of powerful foes and had not only endured but triumphed. That evening their lodges were filled with songs of victory, drums echoing into the night. Horses captured in the battle were paraded proudly, coup tales were told and retold, and young warriors were honoured for their courage. But beneath the celebration lay a deeper meaning. The battle was proof that the Blackfoot were not to be broken, even when enemies combined against them. Their strength lay not only in the ferocity of their warriors, but in the unity of their confederacy, the bond that tied Blood, Piegan and Blackfoot together as one people. For generations afterward the story was told, of how the Blackfoot stood against three nations and held their ground. It became a reminder of resilience, a lesson to the young that courage and unity could overcome even the greatest of odds. The Crow, known to themselves as the Apsayaluke, children of the large-beaked bird, lived on the vast sweep of land that stretched from the Yellowstone River through the plains of present-day Montana and Wyoming. To outsiders, their world was a wilderness of endless horizons, jagged mountains and wide rolling valleys. To the Crow, it was home, and every bend in the river, every peak on the horizon carried stories of ancestors and spirits who had walked there before. Unlike some of the other nations of the plains, the Crow were not defined solely by war. They were a people of both fierce warriors and skilled diplomats, balancing bravery with careful alliances. Yet when war came, they fought with a ferocity and cleverness that made them both respected and feared. The Crows' reputation was shaped by their unique place in the geography of the plains. They lived between powerful nations, the Lakota to the east, the Blackfoot to the north, the Shoshone to the west, and the Cheyenne and Arapaho to the south. This meant they were always under pressure, always needing to defend their lands from encroachment. But it also gave them a keen sense of strategy. The Crow became experts at maneuvering between stronger forces, sometimes allying with one enemy to weaken another, sometimes retreating into the mountains to wait out a storm. Their warriors were renowned for their horsemanship, a skill honed to near perfection. Crow riders could guide their ponies with their knees, leaving their hands free for bow or lance. They could hang off the side of a galloping horse, shielded from arrows, and then rise up at the last instant to strike. Young boys learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and by the time they were teenagers, they could race bareback across the plains, their hair streaming behind them, their voices carrying the high-pitched war cries of their people. One of the defining traits of the Crow was their practice of coup, counting honour by daring to touch an enemy in battle without killing him. Among the Crow, this act was held in even higher esteem than taking a life. A warrior who could ride directly into danger, brush his coup stick against an armed foe, and then escape unscathed was considered blessed by the spirits. In this way, Crow warfare was not just about victory, it was about proving courage, skill, and spiritual strength. But courage alone could not protect them from the storm that pressed on their borders. The Lakota, growing ever more powerful, sought to expand westward, and the Crow lands lay directly in their path. Time and again, Crow scouts spotted columns of Lakota riders sweeping across the plains, their lodges set aflame, their herds scattered. To survive, the Crow had to adapt. They fought as much with cunning as with force. Instead of meeting overwhelming armies head-on, they often struck with speed, raiding enemy camps at night, seizing horses, scattering supplies, and disappearing into the hills before the enemy could respond. The mountains were their greatest ally, the towering Absaroka and Bighorn ranges, where narrow valleys and treacherous passes offered sanctuary that few outsiders dared to pursue. Here the Crow could vanish into the snow-fed streams and forests, their enemies left behind on the open plains. The Crow also gained renown as scouts for other powers. In later years, as outsiders pressed deeper into the plains, the Crow allied themselves with the newcomers, offering guidance across the vast lands they knew better than anyone else. But long before that, their reputation as keen observers and swift messengers was legendary among the tribes. A single Crow scout could cover astonishing distances in a day, carrying word of an approaching war party, or the location of migrating herds. And always there were the battles, fierce, sudden, and unforgettable. Tales told in Crow lodges spoke of warriors like Plentycoos and Two Leggings, who embodied the courage and cunning of their people. These men led raids deep into enemy territory, stealing horses in the dead of night, striking blows that would be remembered for years. One story tells of a Crow war party venturing against the Cheyenne in midwinter. Wrapped in buffalo robes, they crept close to a rival camp, the air so cold it made their lungs ache. As dawn broke, they surged in, their war cries cutting the stillness, arrows flashing through the air. Horses were driven off in a thunder of hooves, lodges torn open, supplies seized. By the time the Cheyenne rallied, the Crow were already disappearing into the snow, their laughter and victory songs echoing behind them. For the Crow, such raids were more than survival. They were affirmations of identity. To be Crow was to ride boldly, to strike swiftly, to hold honour above all else. And though surrounded by powerful nations, the Apsaluke endured, their name carried in whispers of both fear and respect across the plains. And so our story draws to a close, having walked the long trails of the Comanche, the Apache, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Crow, and so many others whose names still echo across the Great Plains. These were peoples of courage and endurance, of strategy and spirit, who shaped not only the histories of their own lands, but also the memory of an entire continent. Their lives were bound to the wind, the horse, the hunt, and the endless horizon, fierce and free in a way that seems almost otherworldly now. Though the centuries have passed and the world they knew has changed forever, the stories remain, whispering through the grass, painted on the sky at dusk, and carried in the voices of those who still remember. Tonight, as you rest, let those echoes be your guide, a reminder that the most feared were also the most alive, and that their spirit, like the land itself, endures.